The stray dog did not bark when Claire Bennett touched his collar for the first time. He froze. Every muscle in his thin body locked so suddenly that the metal adoption tag slipped from her fingers and hit the concrete floor with a sharp clink that echoed through the shelter hallway. The room went silent. Even the other dogs stopped barking. Claire stared at the animal sitting in front of her. His ribs showed through his dirty brown fur, and one of his ears had a small tear near the tip, but it was his eyes that unsettled her most. He was not looking at her. He was staring directly at the shelter entrance like he was waiting for someone to walk through those doors at any second. "That's Rusty," the shelter volunteer whispered from behind the desk. "He's been acting strange ever since they brought him in." Claire slowly crouched again, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling building in her chest. The shelter smelled like disinfectant and wet fur, and outside, rain tapped softly against the windows of the old building. She had only come there to adopt a dog. Something simple. Something to make the apartment feel less empty after almost a year of living alone. But the moment she saw Rusty sitting perfectly still in the far corner kennel while every other dog barked for attention, she could not stop looking at him. The volunteer opened the gate carefully. "Just be careful with the collar," she said quietly. "He doesn't like anyone touching it." Claire frowned. The collar looked old, cracked, and faded from years of weather. It was far too expensive for a stray dog. Thick dark leather, heavy silver buckle, military style. But what made her stomach tighten was the engraving on the metal plate attached beneath it. "If found, don't call the police." Claire blinked twice to make sure she had read it correctly. "What does that even mean?" she asked nervously. The volunteer shook her head. "No idea. Animal Control found him 3 days ago wandering near Blackwater Road, about 40 miles outside town. No chip, no owner reports. Nothing." Rusty suddenly stood up. Not aggressively. Slowly, carefully. His paws clicked softly against the concrete as he walked toward Claire, then stopped inches away from her knees. His nose lifted toward her hand, trembling slightly, before he looked back toward the shelter entrance again. Waiting, watching, listening. Claire felt a chill crawl up her arms. "Has anyone tried removing the collar?" The volunteer's expression changed instantly. "One guy did." Claire looked up, and Rusty nearly broke through the kennel trying to stop him. Claire swallowed hard. The dog remained perfectly calm beside her, but now she noticed something else. Tiny scratches covered the metal buckle itself, almost like someone had tried opening it with a knife over and over again. Outside, thunder rumbled across the parking lot. The lights inside the shelter flickered once. Then Rusty suddenly stepped in front of Claire and let out a low growl toward the front door. Not loud, not violent, but terrified. A second later, someone knocked 3 times on the shelter's glass entrance door, and Rusty immediately backed into the corner, shaking. The shelter volunteer slowly pulled the blinds closed over the glass entrance after the knocking stopped, but Rusty did not move from the corner. His entire body trembled against the concrete wall while rainwater dripped from his fur onto the floor beneath him. Claire remained kneeling several feet away, unable to explain why her chest suddenly hurt when she looked at him. The dog was terrified, but it was not the kind of fear she had seen in abused animals before. This felt different. It felt like waiting, like disappointment, like someone who had spent too long hoping for a door to open. Nobody was there, the volunteer finally said after peeking outside. Probably some teenagers messing around in the storm. But Rusty continued staring toward the entrance long after the lights outside the parking lot stopped flickering. Claire noticed his breathing slowly calm only after the volunteer removed the old collar from the adoption paperwork clipboard and placed it beside him again. The dog immediately lowered his head onto his paws, pressing his nose against the worn leather as if he needed to make sure it was still there. "He does that every night," the volunteer whispered softly. "He never sleeps unless the collar stays close to him." Claire looked down at the dog more carefully now. Rusty was older than she first thought. Not elderly, but tired. Deep exhaustion clung to him in a way that made him seem heavier than his body actually was. The shelter worker explained that during the first night after Animal Control brought him in, they had removed the collar for cleaning. Rusty had panicked so badly that he scratched at the kennel door for hours until his paws bled lightly against the metal. Ever since then, nobody touched it unless absolutely necessary. "Does he eat?" Claire asked quietly. The volunteer nodded slowly. "Only if someone sits nearby while he eats." Claire felt another strange pull in her chest. She watched as Rusty carefully stood and walked toward a small stainless steel water bowl near the kennel wall. He drank slowly, then turned his head back toward the shelter entrance again before returning to the corner. Always checking, always waiting. Did anyone ever come looking for him? Claire asked. No, the answer came too quickly, too sadly. That is the strange part. Dogs this trained usually belong to someone. He knows commands. He reacts to hand signals. He never barks without reason. But nobody claimed him. Rusty suddenly lifted his head again. Not toward the entrance this time. Toward the small office television mounted above the reception desk. A local news station was playing quietly in the background while storm alerts scrolled across the screen. The moment a reporter mentioned the nearby county line, Rusty stood up so abruptly that his water bowl tipped over. Claire froze. The dog walked closer to the television, ears raised, eyes locked on the screen with painful intensity. Then the segment changed to weather coverage, and something inside Rusty seemed to collapse. He lowered himself slowly back onto the floor, letting out the quietest sound Claire had ever heard from an animal. Not a bark, not a whine, more like the sound of hope disappearing. The volunteer looked away uncomfortably. Sometimes he reacts to certain voices, she admitted. Claire swallowed hard. What voices? Before the woman could answer, Rusty suddenly crawled beneath the metal bench near the wall and pressed himself into the shadows. Claire followed his gaze. Outside the rain-covered window, a dark pickup truck had just pulled into the shelter parking lot for the second time that night. The dark pickup truck remained parked outside the shelter for less than 30 seconds before slowly backing out into the rain again without anyone stepping out. Claire watched the red taillights disappear through the storm while Rusty stayed hidden beneath the metal bench, trembling so hard that the bench legs rattled softly against the tile floor. Something about the entire situation felt wrong now. Not dramatic, not dangerous exactly, just wrong in a quiet way that made it difficult to breathe normally. The volunteer eventually convinced Claire to finish the adoption paperwork before closing time. She almost changed her mind twice while signing the forms, especially after noticing Rusty refused to come near the front entrance again. But every time she looked at him, she saw the same exhausted sadness in his eyes. It was the kind of sadness that made people stop asking questions because they were afraid of the answers. 40 minutes later, Claire carefully opened the back door of her Subaru in the shelter parking lot. Rusty stood frozen under the awning while rain poured down around them in silver sheets. It is okay, Claire whispered gently. You are safe. Rusty did not move. Then, after several long seconds, he suddenly turned and scanned the empty road behind the shelter before jumping into the car, so quickly it startled her. During the drive home, the dog never once looked out the windows. Instead, he stayed low on the back seat with his eyes fixed on the rear windshield the entire time, like he expected another vehicle to appear behind them. Claire tried turning on soft music. Rusty reacted instantly. Not barking, not growling. He lunged upward and pressed one paw against the radio until she shut it off. The silence inside the car became painfully heavy after that. By the time they reached her apartment building in North Milwaukee, the storm had weakened into cold drizzle. Claire lived alone on the second floor above a quiet hardware store, and the small apartment normally felt peaceful at night. But the moment Rusty stepped inside, his behavior changed again. He began walking through every room with slow, deliberate movements, sniffing corners, vents, windows, even the locks on the doors. Not like a curious dog exploring a new place, more like someone inspecting a building for danger. Claire watched uneasily from the kitchen while carrying in a bag of dog food and blankets. Rusty paused in the hallway outside her bedroom. His ears lifted slightly. Then he walked backward 3 full steps without taking his eyes off the darkroom. Claire felt chills spread across her arms. Rusty, the dog suddenly hurried away from the hallway and pushed himself beneath the dining room table. 10 minutes later, Claire poured food into a bowl near the kitchen wall. Rusty refused to touch it. He kept staring toward the apartment door instead. Finally, after almost an hour, Claire sat cross-legged on the floor several feet away from him. Only then did Rusty slowly approach the food bowl and begin eating in complete silence. Halfway through the meal, he suddenly stopped chewing. His head snapped toward the ceiling above them. Claire listened carefully, but heard nothing except rain tapping against distant windows. Rusty stood completely still for nearly 20 seconds. Then, without warning, He grabbed the metal food bowl with his teeth, carried it into the bathroom, and shoved it hard beneath the sink cabinet before backing into the corner and lowering himself flat against the floor. Claire stared at him in confusion. "Why are you doing that?" Rusty did not look at her. He kept staring at the apartment ceiling. A few seconds later, footsteps slowly creaked across the apartment directly above them, and Rusty immediately covered his nose with both paws like he was trying not to make a sound. Claire barely slept that night. Every sound inside the apartment seemed to trigger another strange reaction from Rusty. If pipes groaned inside the walls, he immediately moved away from the windows. If headlights swept across the ceiling from passing cars below the street, he rushed toward the hallway and stood completely still until the light disappeared. But the behavior that disturbed Claire most happened a little after 4 in the morning. She woke up to a soft metallic scraping sound coming from the kitchen. At first she thought Rusty had knocked over his food bowl again, but when she stepped into the dark hallway, she froze. The dog was sitting directly in front of her apartment door holding his old leather collar in his mouth. Slowly, carefully, he pushed the collar beneath the narrow gap at the bottom of the door as far as it would go, then backed away into the shadows near the dining table. Claire stared in confusion. "What are you doing?" Rusty remained completely silent. A few seconds later, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway outside the apartment. Someone stopped near her door. Claire felt her stomach tighten instantly. The shadow beneath the doorway darkened for a moment like someone was standing directly outside. Rusty pressed himself lower against the floor without making a sound. Then the footsteps continued down the hall and disappeared toward the stairwell. The moment the noise faded, Rusty hurried forward and pulled the collar back toward himself using his teeth before retreating again into the corner. Claire could not stop thinking about it the next morning. By sunrise, she looked exhausted, and Rusty looked worse. Dark circles framed Claire's eyes while the dog barely touched his breakfast. He spent most of the morning moving from window to window inside the apartment, checking the street below every few minutes. Around noon, Claire finally called the shelter volunteer for advice. "I think something is wrong with him," she admitted quietly while watching Rusty pace beside the living room radiator. "He keeps hiding things whenever he hears footsteps." The woman on the phone sighed heavily. "Honestly, Claire, some dogs from traumatic situations develop obsessive behaviors. It can get worse after adoption." Claire looked at Rusty again. The dog had stopped pacing. He was staring directly at her cell phone. The moment the volunteer continued speaking, Rusty suddenly walked forward and knocked the phone from Claire's hand with his nose hard enough to send it sliding across the hardwood floor. Claire jumped in shock. "Rusty!" The dog immediately backed away as if regretting it, but his body remained tense. The volunteer's voice crackled faintly through the speaker. "That is not normal behavior. If he becomes reactive, you may need to bring him back before somebody gets hurt." The sentence sat heavily inside Claire's chest all afternoon. She hated herself for even considering it, but exhaustion and anxiety slowly began replacing sympathy. By evening, she found herself locking the bedroom door while showering because she no longer trusted what Rusty might do if startled. And Rusty seemed to feel the distance growing between them. He stopped approaching her completely after sunset. Instead, he remained beside the apartment door, ears alert, eyes fixed on the hallway outside, as if guarding something invisible. Around 8:30 that night, Claire's upstairs neighbor knocked gently on her door. Mrs. Holloway was an elderly widow who often borrowed sugar or complained about noisy tenants. But tonight her expression looked nervous. "I do not mean to alarm you," she whispered carefully, "but there has been a dark truck circling this block 3 times since yesterday." Claire felt cold immediately. Before she could answer, Rusty suddenly lunged between them and slammed his body against the closed apartment door so violently that the deadbolt rattled. Mrs. Holloway gasped and stumbled backward into the hallway. Rusty stood rigid in front of the door now, teeth exposed for the first time since Claire met him. And downstairs, someone slowly began trying to open the building's front entrance. Claire stood frozen in the middle of the apartment while the sound of someone struggling with the building's front entrance echoed faintly from downstairs. Rusty remained pressed against the apartment door, every muscle rigid beneath his soaked brown fur. Mrs. Holloway had already retreated halfway down the hallway, clutching her robe tightly around herself with frightened eyes. "That dog is going to hurt somebody," she whispered nervously before disappearing into her apartment and locking the door. Claire's Heartbeat hammered painfully in her chest. Part of her wanted to believe Rusty was only scared, but another part was beginning to wonder if bringing him home had been a terrible mistake. The noise downstairs stopped after a few tense minutes. Then silence returned to the building. Rusty slowly stepped away from the door, but refused to relax completely. He paced in tight circles near the entrance for nearly an hour afterward, while Claire sat on the couch, pretending to watch television she could not focus on. Every few minutes the dog paused beside the hallway closet near the kitchen. Not scratching, not sniffing, just standing there silently for several seconds before moving away again. Eventually Claire noticed something strange. Each time Rusty approached the closet, he tilted his head slightly toward the smoke detector mounted above it. The behavior repeated so consistently that she finally stood up in frustration. "What is it?" she muttered. Rusty immediately backed away the moment she walked closer. Claire pulled open the closet door. Inside were only winter coats, a vacuum cleaner, and stacked storage bins. Nothing unusual. She almost shut the door again when Rusty suddenly let out a sharp bark behind her. The sound startled her so badly, she dropped one of the storage bins onto the floor. Old papers scattered everywhere across the hardwood. Great. Claire sighed tiredly while kneeling to clean the mess. Rusty remained near the doorway, watching her closely now. His breathing had quickened again. Claire grabbed handfuls of old receipts and magazines before stopping suddenly. Mixed among the papers was a folded yellow envelope she had never seen before. Her name was not on it. Neither was her address. The front simply read, Unit 2B. Claire frowned. She had lived there almost 3 years and had never noticed the envelope buried inside the closet. The paper itself looked old and slightly water-damaged around the edges. Rusty stepped closer the moment she touched it. Claire slowly opened the flap and pulled out a faded photograph. Her stomach tightened immediately. The image showed 2 men standing beside a dark pickup truck near a lake cabin somewhere in the woods. One man had his face partially blocked by sunlight, but the other wore a military jacket. And standing beside him on a leash was Rusty. Claire stared at the picture in disbelief. The dog looked thinner now, older now, but unmistakably the same. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date from almost 4 years earlier. Beneath it were 3 handwritten words. "Keep him hidden." Claire slowly looked up at Rusty. The dog was no longer pacing or acting afraid. He was staring directly at the photograph in her hands. Then something else caught her attention. The dark pickup truck in the picture had a cracked left tail light. Claire suddenly remembered the truck outside the shelter parking lot. The same cracked tail light. A cold wave of realization crept through her chest. Rusty had not been reacting randomly all this time. Before Claire could process another thought, headlights swept silently across her apartment windows from the street below. Rusty immediately grabbed the yellow envelope gently between his teeth and hurried toward the bathroom. Claire followed him in confusion as he nosed the envelope behind the loose panel beneath the sink where he had hidden the food bowl earlier. Then he looked up at her with terrified eyes as a car door slammed outside the building. Claire barely had time to step away from the bathroom sink before Rusty rushed forward again and shoved his body against the cabinet door where the envelope was hidden. Outside, another car door slammed somewhere below the apartment building. Then came footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, moving through the front entrance downstairs. Claire's pulse spiked instantly. Rusty did not bark this time. He did something far stranger. He walked directly into the center of the bathroom, lowered himself flat against the tile floor, and placed both front paws tightly over his ears. Claire stared at him in confusion until she finally heard it too. A faint crackling sound. Static. It was coming from somewhere nearby. Rusty's eyes locked onto the smoke detector above the bathroom door. Claire slowly stood on the edge of the bathtub and reached toward the detector with trembling fingers. "What is going on?" she whispered. The plastic cover snapped loose easily. Inside, tucked behind the battery compartment, was a tiny black electronic device no larger than a house key. A blinking green light pulsed softly at its center. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Someone had planted it there. The realization hit so hard she nearly dropped the detector onto the floor. Rusty immediately stood up and backed away toward the hallway while staring toward the apartment entrance again. The dog had not been afraid of random sounds. He had been reacting to the hidden surveillance device every single time it activated. Suddenly, everything began fitting together in Claire's mind with horrifying clarity. The footsteps, the truck, The panic whenever phones or voices appeared. The way Rusty hid objects beneath the sink and tried pushing the collar under the apartment door whenever someone stood outside. He was not unstable. He was trying to hide things from whoever was tracking him. Claire grabbed the yellow envelope from beneath the sink again and quickly dumped its contents onto the bathroom counter. The faded photograph slipped free beside a second item she had not noticed before. A folded receipt. The paper was badly creased and stained, but one line remained readable. Blackwater Lake Cabin Rental. Claire's stomach twisted. That same location again. Rusty suddenly darted into the bedroom before returning seconds later, carrying something gently in his mouth. Claire froze when she realized what it was. Her laptop charger. More specifically, the charger cord. Rusty dropped it at her feet, then looked toward the blinking device still sitting on the bathroom counter. Claire frowned in confusion. Then understanding hit her. The dog was trying to tell her to disable it. With shaking hands, Claire wrapped the cord tightly around the transmitter and stuffed the entire thing inside a metal cookie tin beneath the kitchen sink. The blinking light immediately disappeared. For the first time since entering the apartment, Rusty finally relaxed slightly. His shoulders lowered. His breathing steadied. Then a sound came from the hallway outside the apartment. A soft metallic click. Someone testing the doorknob. Claire backed away from the entrance in panic while Rusty moved silently in front of her. Not aggressive. Protective. The dog stared at the door with terrifying focus now, but Claire finally understood what she had been seeing all along. Every strange behavior had been a warning. Every hidden object had been protection. Every moment of fear had not been fear for himself. It had been fear for whoever got too close to him. The doorknob moved again slowly from the outside. Rusty turned his head briefly toward Claire, and for the first time since she met him, she no longer saw a dangerous stray dog staring back at her. She saw an exhausted animal desperately trying to keep somebody alive. Claire stood motionless in the kitchen while the apartment doorknob shifted slowly from the outside again. Her hands trembled so badly, she nearly dropped the yellow envelope onto the floor. But Rusty did not panic anymore. He stayed planted between her and the entrance with quiet determination, his tired body angled protectively toward her like he had already made a decision long before she ever brought him home. And suddenly Claire could not stop seeing every moment differently. The food bowl hidden beneath the sink. The way he covered his ears whenever the transmitter crackled to life. The desperate attempts to shove the collar beneath the apartment door before footsteps appeared outside. Even the strange reaction to the phone call from the shelter volunteer. Rusty had never been unpredictable. He had been trying to warn her without understanding how humans explain danger to each other. Claire felt a painful knot tighten in her throat. Earlier that same day, she had considered returning him to the shelter because she thought he was unstable. She had locked bedroom doors because she feared him. Meanwhile, this exhausted animal had spent every second trying to protect her from something she could not even see. Rusty slowly glanced back at her now. For the first time since she met him, the fear in his eyes seemed different. Not fear of people, fear of failing. The sound outside the apartment finally stopped. A few seconds later, footsteps moved away down the hallway. Claire released a shaky breath she did not realize she had been holding. Rusty remained alert another full minute before carefully stepping away from the door. Then something happened that nearly broke her heart completely. The dog walked toward the bathroom sink cabinet and gently rested his head against it where he had hidden the envelope and photograph. Like he was checking whether the secret was still safe. Claire covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "Oh my God," she whispered softly. "You have been carrying this alone the entire time." Rusty lowered himself onto the kitchen floor with visible exhaustion. His paws shook slightly now. Claire noticed small scars hidden beneath the wet fur around his legs and chest, old enough to have faded long ago. Suddenly, the lonely silence surrounding him since the shelter made terrible sense. This dog had not wandered aimlessly for years. He had been surviving, hiding, guarding something important after losing whoever once protected him. Claire slowly sat down on the floor several feet away. This time Rusty did not retreat. He simply watched her carefully while keeping one paw resting against the cabinet beneath the sink. Claire's eyes filled with tears she could not hold back anymore. Not because she was scared now, because she realized how terrified he must have been every single day. The truck, the surveillance device, the hidden photograph. Somebody had been searching for whatever Rusty carried long before Claire ever found him. And somehow this dog had still managed to keep it hidden. Claire remembered the sentence written on the back of the photograph. Keep him hidden. Not hide the evidence. Not hide the truck. Hide him. Rusty himself. Her chest tightened painfully as the meaning settled in. The dog was not just protecting a secret. Somebody once trusted him with their final request. Rusty slowly crawled closer across the kitchen floor until he stopped beside her knees. Then, very carefully, he placed the old leather collar into her lap for the first time. Claire stared down at it through blurred eyes. The cracked leather suddenly felt heavier than before, like the dog had finally decided he could not carry the burden alone anymore. Claire gently wrapped both hands around the collar while Rusty rested his head quietly against her leg. And in that moment, with tears sliding silently down her face, Claire made a decision. She was not taking him back to the shelter. She was going to find out who had been chasing this dog for 4 years and why somebody had risked everything to keep him hidden. The next morning, the rain finally stopped for the first time in 2 days, but Claire still kept every curtain in the apartment closed. She barely slept at all. Every few hours, she checked the locks, looked through the peephole, and listened for unfamiliar footsteps in the hallway. Through it all, Rusty never left the kitchen doorway. Not once. Even exhaustion could not fully overpower whatever instinct had kept him alive for so long. Around sunrise, Claire quietly filled a large plastic storage bin with blankets from her closet and carried it beside the kitchen radiator. Rusty watched her cautiously from across the room while she folded the blankets carefully inside. Then she placed the old leather collar on top and stepped away. You do not have to hide anymore, she whispered softly. Rusty remained frozen for several seconds. Slowly, almost uncertainly, he approached the bin and lowered his nose toward the blankets. Claire noticed his breathing change immediately. Slower, deeper. The dog circled the makeshift bed once before carefully lying down inside it without taking his eyes off the collar. Claire sat quietly on the floor nearby while morning sunlight slowly pushed through the edges of the curtains. For the first time since bringing him home, the apartment no longer felt tense. It felt tired, like both of them had finally stopped running long enough to breathe. A little later that morning, Claire drove to a small copy shop across town instead of using her apartment internet. She scanned the photograph and receipt onto a flash drive while Rusty waited silently beside her chair the entire time. The elderly shop owner smiled at the dog twice, but Rusty never looked away from the front windows. Claire could tell he was still watching for the truck. Before leaving, she purchased a cheap metal lockbox and placed the original envelope, receipt, and photograph inside. The moment she locked it, Rusty rested his chin gently against the box for several seconds, as if memorizing its location. Claire felt tears sting her eyes again. Even now, after everything, he still believed protecting those items mattered more than resting. Back at the apartment, Claire did something she had not done once since adopting him. She removed the old collar completely and carried it into the bedroom without Rusty following her. At first she worried he might panic again. Instead, the dog remained near the kitchen radiator watching quietly while she cleaned years of dirt from the cracked leather using a damp cloth and warm water. Beneath the grime, faded lettering slowly appeared along the inside lining of the collar. Not a serial number, not a military code, a name, Daniel Mercer. Claire stared silently at the worn letters while Rusty slowly walked into the bedroom doorway. The dog did not seem afraid anymore, only tired. Claire gently placed the cleaned collar onto the bed beside her. Was that him? She asked quietly. The man in the picture? Rusty stepped closer until his nose touched the collar once. Then he rested his head carefully on the mattress beside it. Claire felt her chest tighten painfully again. This dog had spent years carrying the last remaining connection to someone he lost. Not because he was trained to, because he refused to let go. That evening, Claire cooked plain chicken and rice for Rusty instead of canned food. He ate slowly beside the radiator while she sat nearby reading old newspaper archives about Blackwater Lake on her laptop. Most searches led nowhere until one article stopped her cold. For years earlier, a former military contractor named Daniel Mercer had vanished after reportedly preparing to expose financial corruption connected to private security operations near northern Wisconsin. His body was never found. Claire slowly looked toward Rusty across the room. The dog had fallen asleep halfway through his meal, curled tightly inside the blanket-filled storage bin with his old collar resting beneath one paw. And for the First time since she met him, Rusty was sleeping deeply enough that he no longer reacted when footsteps echoed faintly through the hallway outside. 3 weeks later, the dark pickup truck never returned to Claire's apartment building again. After quietly turning over the photograph, receipt, and hidden transmitter to a retired investigative reporter she trusted through the local newspaper office, pieces of Daniel Mercer's disappearance slowly began surfacing publicly for the first time in years. Claire never learned every detail of what Daniel had uncovered before he vanished near Blackwater Lake, and honestly, she stopped needing to know. What mattered most to her was what happened afterward. Rusty no longer paced through the apartment every night checking windows and locks. He no longer hid food bowls beneath cabinets or froze whenever footsteps echoed in the hallway. Little changes began appearing one at a time, almost too small to notice at first. One evening, Claire accidentally dropped a spoon onto the kitchen floor and realized Rusty had not flinched. Another morning, she woke up on the couch and found the dog sleeping beside the front door instead of guarding it. But the moment that stayed with her forever happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon in late October. Claire had taken Rusty to a small lakeside park outside the city where the trees had turned deep shades of orange and gold. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold water drifting in from the shoreline. Rusty walked beside her without the old leather collar for the very first time. Claire carried it folded carefully inside her coat pocket instead. Near the end of the trail stood a weathered wooden bench facing the lake. Claire sat there silently while wind rippled across the dark water. Rusty wandered only a few feet away before suddenly stopping near the edge of the shore. For a long moment, he simply stared out across the lake without moving. Claire watched quietly, unsure what he was thinking. Then, very slowly, Rusty turned around and walked back toward her. Not nervous, not searching, not guarding, just calm. He rested beside the bench and lowered his head onto Claire's shoe with a deep, exhausted sigh she had never heard from him before. It sounded like something finally letting go. Claire gently removed the old collar from her pocket and looked at the cracked leather one last time. Years of fear, running, hiding, and protecting had lived inside that single worn piece of leather. Rusty had carried it through storms, empty roads, strange towns, and lonely nights without anyone understanding why. Even after losing the person he trusted most, he still protected what mattered to him. Claire carefully placed the collar into a small wooden memorial box beside the bench. Not thrown away, not forgotten. Rested. Rusty lifted his head briefly and watched her do it. Then, for the first time since she met him, the dog walked away from the collar without looking back. On the drive home, Rusty slept peacefully across the back seat, while afternoon sunlight warmed the windows around him. Claire glanced at him through the rearview mirror at a stoplight and suddenly realized something that made tears quietly fill her eyes again. She thought she had rescued a frightened stray dog from a shelter on a rainy night. But the truth was much bigger than that. Rusty had spent years carrying the final trust of someone he loved, waiting for one human being kind enough to finally understand what he was trying to protect. And once somebody finally did, he no longer needed to be afraid of the world. Because sometimes the bravest souls are not the ones who speak. They are the ones who stay loyal long after everyone else is gone.